Please welcome Senior Vice President of External Affairs of the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, Shannon Colbert.
Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Capital Ocean Week. It's fantastic to see you all. I hope you all had a good lunch, and welcome back. I hope you've had a chance to thank and check out some of our sponsors who have had exhibit booths throughout Capitol Hill Ocean Week and able to learn about the critical work in securing our oceans and Great Lakes. I'm pleased to introduce our next plenary session, Fishing for the Future. We kept this one till after lunch for everyone. When you look throughout U.S. history, you know the stories, the legends. Iconic fisheries like New England cod, Chesapeake Bay oysters, Hawaiian fish ponds, Alaskan king crab. Fishing communities through multiple generations, building working waterfronts. And at the center of all these are people whose identities, cultures, and heritages are tied to the strong, healthy, productive seas. People with entrepreneurial spirits and innovative thinking that are seeking solutions to keep fishing for the future. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Magnuson-Stevens Act. Under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, the U.S. is a recognized global leader in sustainable, cooperatively managed fisheries, with over 50 previously overfished species recovered to healthy and sustainable levels. The prosperity of our nation, the vitality of healthy and secure food sources, the heart and the legacy of our coastal communities. They rely upon the sustainability, the resiliency, and the responsible stewardship of our nation's marine resources. Our next plenary, Fishing for the Future, will discuss how U.S. seafood is entering a new era of innovation, an era where science and technology, infrastructure and investment, and ultimately the workforce development pathways needed, where people are going to be the core of the transformation for American seafood into strong domestic industry. It's my pleasure to introduce a true fisheries champion, Assistant Administrator for NOAA Fisheries, Eugenio Piñeiro Soler. Eugenio oversees all of NOAA Fisheries, the federal agency that is responsible for managing our nation's marine fisheries and conserving protected marine resources. With over 30 years as a successful commercial fisherman, a fisheries captain, and an entrepreneur in his home island of Puerto Rico, and serving as chairman for the Caribbean Fisheries Management Council, Eugenio brings his frontline experiences in leadership to local, regional, national, and transnational fisheries management. A veteran of CHOW, I'd like you all to join me in welcoming back Mr. Eugenio Piñeiro Soler.
Hello, guys. It's great to be here. The title of this section is very close to my heart, Fishing for the Future, because that's a decision I took many, many years ago. Many years ago, before even Magnuson-Stevens was established. 25 years ago, I had the fortune, the good luck, I was with Bill Hogarth. He was the assistant administrator, and I met Ted Stevens. So one day we had this conversation, and when you ask people questions that you never ask yourself, but you say, is this logical? Well, I asked him, why did you create it, Magnuson? He said, well, it was not to manage fish. It was not only meant to manage fish. It was meant to manage people. And that changed my mind, my head completely. Then I realized that at some point, when Magnuson began in '76, there was no coherence by science, management, and fishermen. I, myself, a fisherman, thought I knew it all. I was always right. Arrogant as you can be arrogant, and ignorant as you can be ignorant. So it was through the years that I begin to realize that sometimes you have to adjust the dreams you have to their reality. I come from a tuna fishing town, from a fishing family, and I never had dreams of being anything like an astronaut or a physician, a cop. No, I wanted to be a fisherman, and I did it. So life was not as romantic as it sounds, but it was a very good life that I had at the ocean. And thanks to Magnuson, when I joined the Caribbean Council, and I began to realize that we had to make things much workable. And then I discovered that, yes, that through better science, through better management, and the engagement of fishermen, things can move in the right direction. At this time, sometimes I tell my fishing friends and my position that you have to go to the meetings, you have to learn more science. If you want to go to heaven, you have to die first. That's a message behind it. Yeah. So with that said, I want to move on, but thank you for all the things that all of you do all year long. I'm at the NIMS helm at your service, and remember, sustainable oceans, sustainable seas go hand in hand. They swim together with healthy economies, coastal economies, and that is what we want. Thank you, and with that, I leave you with the guys here.
Thank you, Eugenio. With this, I'm pleased to welcome our moderator, Anoushka Concepcion. Anoushka works at the intersection of science, policy, and practice to establish sustainable and resilient futures for diversified seafood production. With over 30 years of experience, she has led responsive applied research that has translated science into real-world solutions for industry, managers, and ultimately communities. Anoushka currently serves in multiple national and international boards. She is chair of the UN Global Seaweed Coalition Strategic Advisory Council. She is on the board of directors for minorities in aquaculture, and she's also on the executive board for the U.S. Aquaculture Society, where she works to advance global strategies and workforce equity. Please join me in welcoming Anoushka, as well as our esteemed panelists, to the Chow stage.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all doing well and had some nice lunch. Just wanted to thank Assistant Administrator for those really wonderful, inspiring words to help get us started. So again, my name is Anoushka Concepcion, and I'm really excited to moderate today's panel with these amazing panelists. But I just wanted to read something to you before we get started about seafood. Seafood is deeply woven into America's cultural heritage, coastal identity, and food systems. As we look toward the future, innovation is clearly part of the story, but so are people and communities, education, and the knowledge built over generations. Today's conversation explores how we preserve what matters while embracing the ideas, partnerships, and emerging opportunities shaping the next era of American seafood. Rather than formal presentations, this session is designed to be a conversation. And my role as moderator is to simply guide the discussion, keep us on time, and create a space for different perspectives and experiences to connect with one another. We are very fortunate to have 3 panelists joining us today representing different regions of the United States. Their work reflects different but complementary parts of the seafood sector. I'll briefly introduce, or I should say reintroduce, each panelist by name and organization, and then I'll invite them to share a bit more about themselves during their response to our first question. I also wanted to let the audience know that if you do have questions for our panelists, you will see some note cards. Please write your question down on a note card and hand them in, and then that way I'll be able to read them during our question and answer component. So our first panelist is Blake Price, Director of the Southern Shrimp Alliance, and is based in North Carolina. Welcome, Blake.
Thank you very much.
Our next panelist is Tommy Sheridan, who is the Director of the Alaska Blue Economy Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Welcome, Tommy.
Thank you.
And our third panelist is Jessica Hathaway, Communications and Outreach Manager for the Local Catch Network at the University of Maine. Welcome, Jess.
Thank you.
All right, so let's begin. So this conference asks us to think about voyages and breakthroughs, how we honor the past while navigating what comes next. Seafood has always been more than a food source. It is deeply tied to culture, community, livelihoods, and place. So my question for you is, when you think about the phrase fishing for the future, what changes do you believe are necessary for the seafood industry to remain strong and relevant? And what core values or traditions should remain constant as it evolves? And actually, Blake, I'd like to start with you, if you can kick us off.
You look at Tom, me?
Yep.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anoushka. You know, I've been involved with fisheries for about 25, 30 years plus, and the amount of attrition that I've seen in my former capacity as a fishery biologist with NOAA and with the state of North Carolina is more than saddening. Our fishermen, in representing commercial shrimp interests from North Carolina to Texas, and this is really true across the board for United States seafood producers, are faced with a vast array of problems, from working waterfronts, lack of captains and crew, and most prominently, the influx of foreign imports that are often not produced near to the ethical standards, labor standards that we have, or are sustainably managed, like our fisheries are here in the United States. So I take this, I married into a commercial shrimping family about 20 years ago, and this has always been important to me in terms of sustainment of commercial fishing industries and seafood productions, but it's been personal for a long time. And it's not just the captains and the crews and the fishing vessels. Entire communities and regions are established and depend upon these activities. And I think it's paramount that all of us here in this room and with the agencies and really just as consumers and U.S. citizens do everything in our power to maintain and not just sustain, but build these fisheries back up to where they need to be for our food production, for our food safety, for the lack of having a national food security concern, which is at 90% of imports. That's kind of where we are getting.
Great.
Yep.
Yeah, Tommy, would you like to also say a few words?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Tommy Sheridan. I'm the director for the Alaska Blue Economy Center. Very grateful to be here representing Alaska. So ABEC is housed at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I've been in Alaska for 24 years in a variety of capacities. And ABEC, I think I need to define the blue economy first. We should all know what that is, but essentially we're talking about the ocean economy. And where I live in Cordova and Prince William Sound, the blue economy includes a large salmon aquaculture system, renowned commercial fisheries, tourism, shipping. Just around the corner in Valdez is the terminus for the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. So energy is also a big part of that. But increasingly, we've been getting more and more involved in workforce development. It's just an area that I've found really compelling throughout my career. In Alaska, we have significant resources, significant fisheries, but we're the third least populous U.S. state, and we have the most sparse population density, and that makes for some challenges for workforce, and that will be probably a feature of what I'll share here today. We've had in Alaska negative net migration, more people moving out than moving in for 13 years straight. We have a shrinking workforce over the past decade and shrinking school systems. And a lot of this is tied to high variations in seafood production, fisheries over the past decade, where our systems are largely dependent upon the communities generating revenue from seafood landing taxes, and that goes to pay for critical services, including schools. So that's really been a focus for me when I think about fishing for the future. I think about how can we engage our K through 12 students in particular through community colleges and four-year programs and keep them in Alaska.
Thank you. Jess?
Hi, Anoushka. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Jess Hathaway. As Anoushka mentioned, I'm the Outreach and Communications Manager for Local Catch Network, which is a hub for innovation, knowledge sharing, and collaboration in support of local and community-based seafood systems. We work primarily with direct marketers and small-scale seafood businesses. I'm also an independent contractor in the industry, and I came to that by way of serving as editor of National Fisherman magazine for about 16 years. And I'm really happy to be here today. So I am based in Portland, Maine, so I do have somewhat of a Northeast experience in terms of fisheries, but also Local Catch Network is nationwide, as was my experience at National Fisherman, so focused primarily on domestic seafood production. And Eugenio mentioned the Magnuson Act, and it is the 50th anniversary of that act, and I almost share a birthday with Magnuson. I turned 50 this year as well. So I haven't seen its full evolution, but I have looked into it a lot in my research and in talking to people across the industry. The Magnuson Act really was built to incentivize and maximize boat building and fishing effort in the country. And eventually it became, our efforts became overcapitalized. And then that caused a shift to like the rebound effect of the industry then coping with being responsive to crises. So we've been sort of in crises management mode for about 30 years in the industry. And that has led to some benefits. We understand fish habitat a lot more. We have a relatively stable fishery management system, extremely sustainable fisheries in this country. But it also led to managing primarily for sustainability with that lowercase s, it's like focusing on fishery biomass. And what we'd really like to see is the capital S and incorporating more cultural and economic sustainability back into our fishing communities and engaging all components of sustainability into the management of fisheries.
Great. Yeah, go ahead.
That's great, Jess. If I could add, I mean, it's a wonderful achievement. 50 years of MSA and building back fish populations and having that potential to really increase production of our food in this country, our seafood. However, you really can't say that the 50 years of MSA has had a great sustainment on the commercial fishermen and the fishermen populations themselves. And it's not for lack of ability, it's not for lack of desire, it's not for lack of really capacity to do that. Again, we have allowed imports into this country to the tune of, again, 90% of what we eat in our restaurants, in our grocery stores in this country. And having had the opportunity to be on boats from Alaska to California to Florida to Maine, it doesn't have to be like that. And we've got to support our industry. We have got to demand domestic product across the board. So I think it's very important to acknowledge and the successes of the MSA 50th, but also recognize that our commercial seafood producers are in a dire state right now. This isn't something that, it's getting kind of bad. It might be a little bit worse tomorrow. It is very dire. I liaison with industries from, again, Alaska to Maine, and this is not a unique story to the commercial shrimpers from North Carolina to Texas. So appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Now, thinking about the core values and traditions, that traditionally fishing communities, embraced, or really what they're known for. It's kind of like who they are, right? And now, thinking about what changes are needed, could you speak to maybe provide some examples or just really provide your perspective on what types of changes are needed, but at the same time balancing the core values and maintaining that fishing culture and heritage that is so important to these coastal communities, and really it's who they are. Go ahead.
Okay.
Tommy, go ahead.
I'll start, and I'm gonna hammer down on people again, and so. I also turned 50 this year, so it's a big year. There's a lot of 50s going around in Alaska too. There was a lot happening around then. So what was the question again?
So thinking about, it's fine. So
that's what happens when you turn 50.
So
it gets
thinking
worse,
about
Tommy.
the core values and traditions
Sure.
of fishing communities,
Right.
and then changes.
Okay. Well, I mean, the big changes that are taking place again, and this is for fishing families and non-fishing families. We have families that are leaving coastal communities in Alaska, and we're really concerned about just the downward spirals that accompanies that. We need these families there to keep these communities thriving, to support the industry and all of the support businesses that take place there. And right now, we're just seeing an exodus, and we're seeing a lot of folks just wondering if this is where they want to raise their families. So something that I think we could and should do is engage our youth as early and as often and as creatively as possible. And so some of the solutions that we've been working towards is engaging through a few very specific programs through University of Alaska Fairbanks. Science Olympiad is a national program that also takes place in Alaska through UAF with middle schoolers. And so in Alaska, whether it's traditional seafood industry or some emerging opportunities like mariculture, we've been really trying to just raise awareness of seafood industry opportunities, develop skills that they can take with them then into subsequent programs. And so another program that we work with at University of Alaska Fairbanks is Teaching Through Technology, which is a high school program that takes things a little bit deeper, building off of previous work with badging and certification. And the hope is that those students would then connect with programs in the local community colleges and/or at programs like UAF's College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences. So we're really just trying to give folks, whether they're going to go into the seafood industry as fishers with trade skills, hands-on skills, a wide range of skills, or if they're going to go into processing operations, likewise trying to just prepare them for what's to come there. And then if they wanted to go into management, for example, I was also a fishery biologist, and I'll just say that workforce in Alaska is also struggling. So the more that we can do to just encourage families to stay, it's better for the communities, and for the seafood industry in Alaska, it's really important that these communities survive and thrive.
Yeah. So Tommy, you did mention in your intro about other blue economy industries.
Sure.
Right? And so thinking about that, how do you propose, or what is your perspective, I should say, on strengthening, having the long-term strength of the seafood sector? Because it depends upon whether or not the next generation sees this place for themselves in these types of, jobs.
Right.
So, can you think of any, investments, partnerships, or really enabling conditions that are most important or will be most important for not only attracting but supporting and retaining the next generation of seafood professionals, as opposed to them going and doing something else, maybe related to the maritime industry, but not necessarily seafood production?
Right. Well, I mean, Alaska is always dependent upon relationships with external partners. The federal government and federal agencies have always been very active in Alaska and have been a very big part of sustaining all industries in Alaska, including and especially the seafood industry. We've also depended upon relationships with universities across the country and internationally. Alaska is a very special place. And so, you know, some of the recent investments that are not necessarily directly related to traditional commercial fishing but are aligned is something that we've discussed. Mariculture has received a lot of funding in Alaska, about $100 million over the past handful of years. There was a $49 million grant through EDA's Build Back Better Regional Challenge program called the Alaska Mariculture Cluster. The Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trustee Council kicked in $32 million. The Alaska legislature $7 million, and then National Science Foundation another 20. And so, you know, we're all working to try to diversify economies in coastal Alaska, do what we can to support our traditional industries, don't leave them behind, don't forget what our heritage and what the backbone of these communities are, but explore other opportunities to diversify their economy, like mariculture. And so, again, back to workforce development, that's been an angle that we've taken with some of our mariculture funding to engage middle school and high school students in that area of opportunity so that they can either transition right into industry jobs or continue on elsewhere. And that needn't be specific to mariculture. I think we can pivot that glide path, is what we called it, to traditional seafood industry opportunities, visitor industry opportunities, and other blue economy industries in the state.
And Jess, I'm looking at you because I know you, and especially certainly your organization and other organizations in Maine specifically, have done a lot of work in this area. Do you think you could provide some examples of some
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so much of it depends on fishermen's ability to interface with their communities, whether that's local or regional or national. Pete Jaume is a sea urchin diver from California, and he co-founded the Tuna Harbor Dockside Market. And he says that a lot of fishermen who participate in that market are selling fishing, not just fish. And I think that it's a great point. And you know, his market is really serving as a model for other communities to open, you know, fisherman-based dockside markets to sell to their local communities. And you know, we know that our communities can support local fisheries and vice versa, that our local fisheries and seafood production can support the fish demand, you know, the consumption in our communities nationwide. But you know, in order for young people to be choosing careers in fisheries or in other maritime careers, you really have to offer them the opportunity not just to build a job, but to build a career. And so much of our fishery policy has led to consolidation and privatization of fisheries, and that has prevented easy access for entry-level fishermen. So you know, fishing permits are often very expensive, or, you know, so if a fisherman, you know, we talk about diversifying, if a fisherman wants to fish in multiple fisheries, how can a young person invest in a very expensive permit across multiple fisheries and be able to diversify? So that's certainly a significant hurdle, but it also goes back to everything that affects any community. You know, we have to, beyond workforce development, we have to address housing issues and other, you know, working waterfront infrastructure issues. And then you have climate issues that affect our working waterfronts as well. We're seeing extreme storms all over the country. So building that resilience on a community basis is really critical to diversifying across the blue economy, but also to supporting career development in the blue economy.
Blake?
That's great, Jess. I would add and agree, just simple exposure to the possibilities for our youth. Not necessarily via academia, but dockside. I've got a couple boys, they're 22 and 30 now, but for a long time I was concerned that they thought that you could solve all the world's problems on the cell phones that we have in our pockets. And, you know, consumers really, you know, I spent a lot of time here the last 6-7 months or so talking with legislators, government agencies. I spent a lot of time dockside and trying to talk with the general public. When you explain that 90% of the seafood in this country is imported, people's chins drop. When you talk about the unethical production, the toxins that are put in shrimp, their chins drop. And until we make this industry profitable again, it's going to be very hard for recruitment. But the first step is exposure, and the youth development training programs. I recently participated in one in Florida, sponsored by Sea Grant, and you know, it's great just having the kids there to see what could be done, you know, what other opportunity it is. I mean, most of us live behind a laptop or in a plane, train, or car otherwise, but what a great office. What a great office to have as Mother Ocean, and working on your time and supplying for your family and providing food for your region and the nation. And that's very noble. And you know, the simple exposure for kids to realize that is step one. And then we have to enforce our laws in this country. We have to mandate that if imports are going to have a place, the Southern Shrimp Alliance knows that, but it doesn't have to be to the exclusion of our U.S. industries. And when we can enforce our laws and maybe get a couple pieces of legislation that will greatly help out too, you know, to cap or, you know, limit in some degree, shape, form, or fashion the amount of imports here, and to allow our U.S. industries to rebuild and flourish, we'll make it profitable, and we'll make it once again attractive. You know, most of the folks that I work with and represent in the shrimp industry tell me, you know, the average age of a captain's 62 years old. And in little cells, you see some recruitment here and there from North Carolina to Texas, but that's basically the average age of a captain. And they're not gonna continue captaining at 82, you know, another 20 years. So we have to have that recruitment, and it starts with exposure, development programs, and enforcing our laws and making this profitable again.
So something I'm hearing is accessibility. Right, accessibility for the next generation. You can tell a story, and that's great. Narratives are important, but providing that platform and that framework and the structure, the support structure for the next generation to come in and be able to, you know, have more accessibility to a diversity of permits, right, for fisheries, accessibility to workforce development training programs. So that's kind of a theme I'm seeing here, which, and just kind of going with that theme and thinking about long-term support for these types of programs. For example, workforce development. What do you see the needs are? What do you see any gaps? Are you noticing gaps where, for example, with a lot of programs, funding will run out? Now what? How are you going to continue to reach the next generation? Any thoughts or perspectives on, you know?
I'll jump in. I think just raising awareness that workforce issues are universal. It's not just Alaska, it's happening everywhere. Our case may be extreme, but for some of these large funding opportunities, just getting folks to understand that K through 12 STEM is relevant, and it can be workforce awareness, workforce development. Unfortunately, when we were developing the Alaska Mariculture Cluster, the $49 million EDA grant, K through 12 STEM was excluded from that opportunity, and that was just a really big missed opportunity. So we've all done what we can to make up for that, and part of the more recent discussions for funding entities or agencies is just we need to do a few things differently here, including how do we dip earlier into that pipeline, so to speak. They might not be our employees right now, but it's going to happen here pretty quick. And in Alaska, we start pretty early. So our son is participating in his first commercial set net salmon fishery today. He's 14, and he's been participating in Science Olympiad with us. We brought some 8th graders to Fairbanks last year as a part of Science Olympiad, and they met some funders there, and all of a sudden they came home and they're 3D printing drones and learning how to operate their drones to count salmon in local streams. So I don't think it's too early to start there, and these folks will be making meaningful contributions relatively quickly.
If I could just add real quickly something that I thought about while you were talking, and at least along the South Atlantic and the Gulf, and I'm sure elsewhere, I'm sure throughout the country, just 30 years ago, there were K through 12 maritime programs that taught net building, that they taught knot tying, that there was, whatever, boat skills that they were taught in school, and those programs are largely gone. Last year, I was very encouraged to hear in McIntosh, Georgia, there is a program there, and I'm sure there are a few elsewhere. But why? Why did we stop that? I've never met a commercial fisherman who is not an electrician, a carpenter, a plumber, a welder, a fiberglass, constructor in any way. They're jacks of all trades, and if again having that exposure early on to develop those skills to be able to hop on a boat. Of course, most of your commercial fishing learning is going to be on the vessel, but that would be a great segue as it once was, 30 or 40 years ago, and I don't really understand why we've stopped those programs.
Yeah. I just want to add, too, that it's not always just straight workforce development opportunities that expose people to fisheries, but Sea to School programs across the country are introducing young people to just eating seafood in their schools or through other programs, and that is, for many people, their entry point into knowing what seafood and fisheries are, or what their seasonal, local products are. What's being landed at their local docks, and how does that get to them to the plate? So that, I think, is a lot of those programs are supported through USDA programs, and so I think that the new Office of Seafood is a really good opportunity to continue to support those programs and hopefully, ideally, expand it to more workforce development so that you're getting that exposure to those skill sets and opportunities at every age.
So something that I've heard some of you sort of allude to is really that the seafood systems, but the lived experiences of the people doing the work as well, and that intergenerational knowledge sharing, right, which I think is really key. So what makes a career in the seafood sector rewarding? I'm going to kind of encourage more people to get in seafood, right? So if you were to talk to a young person now, what makes it so rewarding? What do you love about it? What do you love about being in this sector?
Well, I love advocating for it, but as Eugenio mentioned, it's not always roses and sunshine. I think the sense of, again, supplying a product, sustenance for your family, for your community, for the nation is, again, very noble. And the rewards that can be gained out of that, despite some often contrary discussion about commercial fishermen, they really are stewards of the environment. They want to ensure that the product that they're catching is there for future generations. And they're all very concerned about the future generations. They know what they have gotten out of it on a personal and monetary level, and they want to see that continue. Because again, the office alone would be great enough to have a Mother Ocean every day. But I think it's possible to have. Yeah.
Do you want to go first this time?
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not a fisherman myself, but Local Catch Network really focuses on building community, and all of our gatherings, whether they're virtual or in person, we get the feedback that people really appreciate the opportunity to share stories with each other and connect, and also experience what's different about different ports and different places. And one thing that I've noticed in talking to a lot of fishermen is that they're just really proud that they feed people. That's what they do for a living. Commercial fishermen feed the world. And, we want to make sure they continue to have the opportunities to do that. It's really important to our communities that we see local food production happening, and we're still connected to that source of nourishment.
So I'll admit as well, I've never technically been a commercial fisherman. But I grew up on a barrier island on the east coast of Florida, and I grew up underwater, on the water, in the water. Just loved fish, loved to catch them, loved to touch them. And yet I just had no idea that commercial fisheries existed. And so I think that's probably a missed opportunity that hopefully folks are addressing more. I've been gone from Florida for quite some time. In Alaska, it's a little bit more obvious, but it's still no less fun. It's a ton of fun. And so I think that's what has drawn my son into it, for example. He gets to work at a set net site with his closest friend and their family. And so there's just a level of camaraderie that goes along with the work that is maybe unique and fun. And so I think just helping young people wherever they are to understand that those opportunities do exist is important if we want this industry to continue to do what we need it to do. We need food. Ultimately, we need high quality, clean protein that is generally very environmentally friendly. And so anything that we can do to help folks understand that those opportunities are out there, I think would be good.
If I could just add, I've said before, it's not just the captains and crew and the fishermen. These entire communities depend upon it. And that should be attractive to the young workforce too, to be a part of their community and region and sustaining that. If you have to invest $50,000+ into your boat or your gear before you even start the season, that money stays right there. It goes to the local net shops and the hardware stores, and the guy at the hardware store can, then make money and buy his daughter the favorite backpack that she wants for school. And I'll say a couple more times, the urgency here to act couldn't be greater, because as these working waterfronts are lost, as the distribution centers are consolidated or wiped out, as the captains age out, as the boats age out, it doesn't come back. And in a lot of ways, I feel like 90% of this country has forgotten that food does not come from the grocery store, period and end. We are also at the Southern Shrimp Alliance very encouraged by the establishment of the USDA Office of Seafood, and first and foremost for the recognition of the food source that it is. And one more thing, just, again, imports are going to remain and have a place here. Having spent time on other programs internationally, there's some big ports and a lot of product being shipped. And that will remain, and that needs to remain, but it does not need to be to the exclusion and the downfall of our U.S. industries.
Thinking about identity and purpose in the seafood sector, right? and maintaining a positive well-being, right, especially for our seafood producers. What, from your perspective, what do you think needs to change or improve, especially if we want the next generation to build long-term sustainable careers in this space? Again, thinking about well-being, identity, and purpose. And you can reiterate, things that you've said before. But I think since we're talking about people and the communities and the people that produce our seafood.
Yeah, one of the things that we got, so Local Catch Network runs a local seafood summit every 3 years, and we just had one in Gulf Shores, Alabama in November. And we got pretty consistent feedback across the board that fishermen would like more access to wellness resources, so mental health care, but also physical health. What can they do while they're on the boat or on the way to the boat or in between that can improve their mental and physical health? And that also has us thinking about, fishermen don't always have access to affordable insurance, whether that's health insurance or life insurance. Boat insurance is more and more difficult to come by, so there are lots of resources that fishermen need just on a day-to-day basis that are difficult to procure. So streamlining some accessibility and some options for fishermen, especially if you can base it in their community or their gear type and create insurance pools for them to buy into, those could really be life-changing for fishing families and fishing communities too.
Great. Thank you. Did you want to add something?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think, for people who grow up in coastal communities, commercial fishing families, commercial fishing communities, they just grow up with a certain understanding of what that is and what that means. They understand that many of these communities are among the most conservation-oriented that you will find. And whether they go into the fisheries or if they go into, some adjacent opportunity and or maybe even especially from my perspective at the university, continue on into the university, it's important for them to bring those stories and those understandings with them to those places of learning, because so often the narratives and the stories in many academic settings is to focus on the worst case scenarios, which we certainly can learn much from. And so there's a lot of good that comes out of that, but oftentimes you find folks coming out of those environments who are generally anti-commercial fishing, for example. And so that's something that I think young people who grow up in some of these communities, who grow up in commercial fishing, maybe even commercial fish themselves, I think that's an important opportunity and role for them to play, in my opinion.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
I was just going to say, in speaking of narratives and, rehumanizing the commercial fishing industry. Overfishing occurred in fisheries in this country in the 60s and 70s, but that hasn't happened really since. And that's great. Again, that's a great job of the implementation of the MSA, and here on the heels of the 50th, it's critical to realize that these guys, we've got to preserve the commercial fishermen and the areas and the infrastructure that they need to work as well, because they are stewards of the environment. It's their livelihood. They don't want to go out and crush the environment. And between state and federal fishery managers, the United States commercial seafood producers have bent over backwards to comply, to implement, to research, design, develop bycatch mitigation measures, to adhere to policies and programs that have made those fisheries, the fish themselves, sustainable. But without enforcement of our laws at the international level, and without getting some kind of cap on the imports coming in, it's a continuous decreased profit margin. And the guys that remain in it, they're not going to encourage, maybe a little bit, there's been some pivots here haven't been encouraging their kids to get into it in the last 15 to 20 years as a whole, as it was 30 or 40 years ago. So, helping spread that positive narrative. They are stewards of the ocean and the sea. They do want to have the resource sustained. They are, compliant with regulations, and we need to demand that in every other sector throughout the world that we buy seafood from. Why do marine mammal protection and sea turtle protection and all the other environmental protections we implement here if just across the pond, that's not happening? It makes little sense. And if we did that, we'll de-incentivize the bad actors from dumping product on our shores and incentivize mariculture, aquaculture, or ethically produced seafood producers to gain market share and provide ethically produced seafood to us. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Now, when we talk about the future of American seafood, right, the conversation is increasingly broader than just any one of those components, right, or a single component. Things like food security, as we mentioned, and domestic production, but also innovation, you mentioned sustainability, they all point toward a more integrated seafood system, right? So where do you see the greatest opportunities for wild harvest fisheries, mariculture, aquaculture, and other types of innovation to complement one another in building the future of American seafood? So if we put it all together, where do you see it going?
That is the $64,000 question, right? Yeah, go ahead. Jess. Yeah. She's like, I'm not even taking that one.
I'll jump in. I think in Alaska, there's a lot of interest right now in trying to do more with what we have. So maximizing utilization of the resources that we have, minimizing waste, avoiding bycatch, all of that. There's significant technological advances that have been made to achieve that. Something I'll share is that there's a lot of interest in the Icelandic model. And so in Alaska, I and others that I've been working with are working to partner with the Iceland Ocean Cluster, Alaska Seafood Marketing Institute, Alaska Fisheries Development Foundation, on trying to learn from those models and how can we do things maybe better, get more value out of our products in Alaska. And then also connecting with the network of cluster organizations that are developing around the country. Iceland Ocean Cluster is kind of the gold model, but in Seattle we have Maritime Blue. There's efforts, Oregon Ocean Cluster comes to mind, Maine Ocean Cluster comes to mind. And so those are some areas that I'm interested in.
I think he said marketing, and that is hugely needed. And again, most of the seafood producers that I've spoken with, if not all, and certainly the Southern Shrimp Alliance, were very encouraged by the Office of Seafood being able to help promote seafood products, same as they have with agricultural products. At the end of the day, it takes the consumers. The consumers can be really the biggest savior, I think, of the industry to demand U.S. wild caught. And if not, demand that the product you're eating was produced, whether that was grown, aquaculture, mariculture, or commercially fished, with the same standards that we have in this country. We've lost about half of the value of the shrimp fishery in just 2 years, from 23 to 24. We saw a fairly decent little uptick last year. And now with, probably the most biggest expense for fishermen, fuel spikes, have left a lot of people tied to the docks. And we need to have resiliency in our commercial fishing industries that can adapt and be able to absorb that. And the only way to have that is to increase the profit margins. And one of the primary ways to do that is from consumers. So I encourage you all to ask the hard questions the next time you go to the restaurant. You'll be surprised at what the waiters and barkeeps and the chefs will tell you. But we should demand it. You know, we should demand it for our kids. We should demand it for our grandkids to have safely and ethically produced food in this country.
One word you mentioned, like, excuse me, was resiliency. So what about cross-sector collaboration? And I'm just thinking about, for example, wild capture fisheries and mariculture or aquaculture. What types of cross-sector collaborations can you provide examples for?
Well, there's a lot of shared infrastructure to be had there, and there's a lot of investment, as Tommy can attest to, in mariculture development. And so, yes, there's a lot of opportunity to boost our existing industries with the investment that's happening in mariculture. You know, the overwhelming majority of fisheries in this country are really powered by small-scale fisheries and rural fishing communities. And so their voices are very rarely and inconsistently heard and incorporated into the policies that affect their lives and their livelihoods. And hopefully with new investment in some of those in adjacent sectors, we might start to hear their voices being incorporated into the policies that support that development. But in a lot of ways, it's incumbent upon those people who are, you know, entering into those new sectors to open the floor to the people who already live and work in the working waterfronts.
What comes to mind for me is in the mariculture discussion, and again, mariculture in Alaska is just a term we use to describe marine aquaculture of kelp and shellfish, largely oysters in Alaska, but there are other species that folks are exploring. That full utilization discussion that I was just referencing, in Alaska, there's interest in integrating kelp production into Alaska's salmon hatchery system, for example. And so that's just an example potentially of integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. And I've heard the USDA Office of Seafood brought up a few times here, and I'll just share that, you know, there we're talking about mariculture and wild capture and aquaculture kind of collaborating. But I think there's some interesting overlap, of course, with the seafood industry and the USDA Office of Seafood. What's interesting about mariculture in Alaska, especially kelp, is that there's the potential to do this at large scale, just given the geographic scale of our coastline. We have more coastline than the lower 48 combined, and so there's the potential for opportunity there. Some markets that are relevant to USDA include product development as it relates to integrating kelp into livestock feed, integrating kelp into soil applications, and so there's the potential for a coastal industry adjacent to seafood, actually contributing to the agricultural sector in the country.
Right. And also, the many fishermen, for example, in Alaska, during their off-season, are exploring mariculture as well, correct?
Salmon fishers,
Yep.
especially, you know, salmon return in the summer for the most part, and for kelp for now, we're out planting in October, November, and harvesting in April, May, and so it's a good complement. So a lot of the early movers in that space are small boat commercial fishermen in communities like Cordova, Kodiak, and elsewhere.
So it keeps working waterfronts working year-round.
Yep.
Yeah, but the flip side of that is developing marketing for that kelp product. I mean, that is going to be key. And, you know, there were regional food business centers that their funding has been eliminated, and I know there are a lot of people who are advocating to bring those back. They serve as innovation hubs for local food systems, and I would love to see that come back and also expand to include seafood. Seafood is food.
Well, the commercial shrimpers would say aquaculture's great, just don't put it on our fishing lines, jokingly. You know, I think a lot of what we've talked about, the first the first step in this is acknowledgement of the problems. And I would like to thank Eugenio and his leadership since his tenure here and throughout his career, as I understand it, and recognizing that these problems are real, and they're again, the amount of attrition just in the last 20 years is striking. I can say that personally because I have been dockside, I have been on boats throughout this country, and we have to fix this. We cannot let this go to 100% imports, and we're not self-sustaining. So I appreciate your acknowledgement and your leadership in addressing some of these problems. I really do. And again, back to the rest of us, I think it's critical that we ask the important questions. We ask the hard questions at our favorite diners. And we demand U.S. wild-caught seafood. Doesn't mean that we have to always have it, but we want to ensure that what we're eating is safe. Because most of the industries, if not all, that I will talk to is the urgency of this could not be overstated. So, yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So I pretty much think we covered what we wanted to talk about, but I'd like to invite some of the audience questions. Thank you very much. While we're getting ready for this component of the panel, I'm going to ask the panelists to sort of provide us with a few, key takeaways that you'd like to leave the audience with. Jess, let's start with you.
Sure, thanks. If we want to chart a path toward a stable and thriving domestic seafood industry, I think it's really important to acknowledge that each of us has a part to play in changing our future and mapping successful and thriving future for domestic seafood. We can ask NOAA and USDA to help us realize our plans, but our trade leaders, our local politicians, support staff like me, all the way down to individual fishermen and harvesters, business owners and consumers alike, we all have a role to play in that future. People talk about thinking outside the box, but I heard recently a description of thinking inside the box, being that you're constrained by factors that you don't have control over. And I think that fishermen have been just really excellent at operating and getting innovative within those constraints. If you look at the COVID era, I don't think any industry pivoted and maximized on creating new streams of seafood sales like the fishing industry did. It was really just remarkable. Their markets disappeared overnight when restaurants closed down, the supply chain was broken, and yet fishermen figured out a way to reach out into their communities and educate people about what they did and find new ways to sell seafood. So I know that that's possible, and I would love to hear their voices and those stories be told more often and publicly. Certainly you can find it at Local Catch Network. We have some Faces of Local Catch and Voices of Local Catch series this year, but there are fishermen all over the country who have stories to tell, and I've talked to thousands of fishermen over my career, and there's something unique in every fisherman that you talk to, and they have amazing stories to tell, and they may not always be eager to talk. Fishermen are independent people, but once you crack that door open, you will really hear some amazing stories from really interesting people.
I'll say workforce development matters, so I'll keep it short because we're running out of time, but I appreciate having the opportunity to discuss that here with you all today.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have anything further.
Okay, that's fine.
No, I will just say, recognize, I encourage each of you to recognize that the seafood that we produce in this country is not only a high quality, ethical, safe seafood product, but it is sustainably managed. It is managed again at the federal and at the federal and state levels for the continuation of these fish populations, and let's do the same with our fishermen populations. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. All right, I'm just going to read a few questions since we don't have much time, so I apologize if I don't get to your question. So the first question from the audience is, as AI and advanced technology become more prevalent in fisheries management, what safeguards are necessary to ensure local knowledge from fishermen remains part of the decision-making process? So you did allude to that earlier, talking about cell phones and,
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I try to stay away from the Chat GPT, but it is just unreal what it can do and assimilate things so fast. I think it could be used in a positive sense for better networking. Most of the folks that I've talked to, if not all, as I keep saying, in the seafood producing world, have isolated or worked on their issues from an Alaska standpoint or a Maine standpoint or the Southeast standpoint. But many of the impacts, there's a core of impacts that is causing, creating these deflated markets. And I'm not sure how AI can help solve that problem, but from a social media standpoint, we're definitely trying to feed it to get that education and awareness out there. But it's time for the commercial seafood industry to really focus on a more collective basis, somehow, in some shape, form, or fashion, to work together and not keep it isolated with shrimpers and longliners from Alaska.
So in Bristol Bay, Alaska, the largest wild sockeye salmon fishery in the world, they are integrating drones and AI into escapement enumeration. So that's generally a process that's always involved people in towers, flying in planes, over streams. That's just becoming increasingly difficult to do. And so it's a pretty exciting project that the Bristol Bay Regional Seafood Development Association is initiating. And I think to answer your question, how do we safeguard that? People will be involved with that process, just in different ways. And so I think it's important that Alaska Department of Fish and Game and fishery managers who have that vested authority remain involved with that process, just to vet it and use that information as they choose.
I'm just going to note, because not everybody knows what escapement means.
Oh.
But basically, they would be counting the salmon that are going back to their natal streams, so that you have enough salmon to reproduce, to create a sustainable fishery, but also not so many that you end up with a boom and bust cycle in the fishery.
Thanks.
I'm no tech expert. I am very wary of everything AI, but what I would love to see from AI is it doing the grunt work that people don't want to do. So I would just encourage, the more we can use AI to perform tasks that we don't need people to perform, things that you don't need to be creative to do. I mean, fishermen are naturally creative and innovative thinkers. So, I don't think that we should be relying on AI to create new things for us, but rather to enable us to do that creative thinking, create the time and space for innovation.
So we have about 30 seconds left, but I did want to bring up this question is we haven't touched on the recreational component of fishing and its contribution to blue economies. What do you see for the recreational sector in reviving coastal economies? Anyone can take it.
The visitor industry, I would just encompass that in Alaska. There are a lot of folks who come to Alaska to just take in the wildlife, including recreational fishing, and certainly that's a really important and big part of our economy that I really didn't mean to disregard. So again, that just comes down to sustainability. We need to ensure that we have the tools and the people to manage these fishery resources so that there can be use by commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, subsistence fishers in Alaska. That's incredibly important.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to thank our panelists, and I wanted to thank all of you for submitting all these great questions. Again, apologies, could not ask all of them. But will you be staying around a little bit and mingling? Yeah. Please feel free to ask our wonderful panelists their questions. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you.
Yeah.
A huge thank you to our moderator, Anoushka, as well as Blake, Tommy, and Jessica. Thank you so much. As I was listening to the conversation you had, I asked myself, what will history say about where we are in this moment, right? Ultimately, what are we going to do about the future of fishing? And how are we also going to fish for the future and create opportunities ourselves? And I feel like we heard a lot of amazing ideas, a lot of needs, a lot of policies, and ultimately things that question us and how do we look at our values? How do we look at our decisions? How do we come together in order to do that? Because we cannot do it alone. So I just want to thank our panel again. I want to make sure that we are going to be going into a short break, but I hope you all will join us back again at 3 o'clock for our next plenary session, Made in America, Our Nation's Marine Heritage. Thank you again to our panel.